Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Elizabeth Gessel, and I'm the Director of Public Programs at Museum of the African Diaspora in San Francisco. MOAD is a contemporary art museum, and our exhibitions and programming inspire learning through the global lens of the African diaspora. As we begin, we want to acknowledge the spaces we are occupying. Though we are gathered virtually, we recognize that non-native people to this land are descendants of settler occupiers or those forcefully brought to this continent. Moad occupies the unceded land of the Ramaytush Ohlone people, and we pay our respects to the Ohlone people and their elders, both past and present, who have stewarded this land throughout the generations. We encourage all to learn more about the native lands that you occupy by visiting nativeland.ca. I welcome you to today's program about Beyond the Sky, a presentation of 4 short films from a selection of contemporary African filmmakers. We are excited to have with us today Beyond the Sky's curator, Leila Weefur, and 2 of the filmmakers, Lebohang, Kganye, and Gonthier. The discussion will be moderated by Yomna Osman. Leila Weefur uses the pronouns he, they, she, is an artist, writer, and curator based in Oakland, California. Through video and installation, their interdisciplinary practice examines the performativity intrinsic to systems of belonging. The work brings together concepts of sensorial memory, abject Blackness, hypersurveillance, and the erotic. Weefur is a lecturer at Stanford University. Lebohang Kganye, primarily known for her photography, often incorporates the archival and performative into a practice that centers storytelling and memory as it plays itself out in the familial experience. Her interest in the materiality of photography is ongoing and explored in a myriad of ways through her use of the sculptural, performative, and the moving image. Born in Niger, Gonthier works and lives in France. His artistic research is freely inspired by the exploration, quests, discoveries, and travels that are as much concrete as they are fantasized. By means of film, drawing, and engraving, photography, and performance, he invites us to a historical reading of forms and universal matters. As a visual artist, he interrogates the deletion of memory in an Occidental society where speed, technology, and progress seem to have become essential values. Yomna Osman is curator, writer, and researcher based between California and Cairo. Her research interest lies in the intersection of forced migration, gentrification, and power dynamics. Her ongoing research investigates contemporary post-conflict landscapes. She is particularly interested in archival and research-based transdisciplinary practices with an emphasis on decolonial and speculative discourses. She currently works in the exhibitions department here at MOAD. So thank you all for being here, and I'm happy to turn it over to you, Yomna.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. And I would like to welcome and thank everyone for coming. I know we had to postpone from a couple of weeks ago, so thank you so much for taking time and returning today. Just a little bit of information about the format. We will be talking for about 35, 40 minutes, leaving 15 minutes at the end for questions. Please feel free to drop in your questions at any time in the chat. And during these 15 minutes, I will present them to the panel and we will all answer them together. So thank you. We will begin. Leila, my first question is to you, since you brought us all here together today. I want to start the conversation by asking you about the exhibition's title. Can you talk a little bit about?
Yes, first I want to thank you all for being here. Thank you, Yomna, for moderating this conversation. Thank you, Yo-Yo and Lebohang, for joining us and for saying yes to my ask. Honestly, I'm really happy to have both of you part of this program. So Beyond the Sky, my focus with this program was to highlight films that are created by and center the contemporary African experience. The title Beyond the Sky, for me, references the ways that these different narratives think beyond the material world and venture into the digital, metaphysical, and historical space. For example, Yo-Yo's film, Buri Bambata, is rooted in the collective imagination, using the motif of the cloud with the literal reference to the sky in sculpture form, taking the community on a dreamlike journey. And Lebohang Kganye's Kesale Tang brings us out of that dream territory in a way into the abstract of memory and family history. It's important for me to say that as a librarian, I curated this program with the understanding that we're all coming to this conversation in some way, identifying in different ways with the continent, right? And identifying differently with concepts of Blackness. Some of those themes we got into in our personal discussions, and hopefully they carry into this conversation. But I like to magnify the interconnected histories of Africa and lean into the complexities of what it means to be and create in dialogue with those histories, those very complicated histories, right? And each of the 4 films in this program have a distinct visual aesthetic, but they all have a connection that I discovered in all of them, a reference to language, whether that language is visual or written language or spoken language. We know that language varies within the continent from country to country. And the language of the beyond, which is what connects us all here today, is ultimately a projection toward the future, a collective African future. So thank you all again for joining us. And thanks, Yomna, for asking.
Thank you. Yeah, sorry, it's really noisy today for no reason. But yeah, I mean, that's really kind of guides me into, thoughts of language and translation, things that I've been also thinking about and were got kind of activated and evoked by the programming, by the 4 films that I watched, and particularly by the 2 films that we're kind of more discussing today. So I find that your chosen protagonists, both Yo-Yo and Lebohang, both protagonists and their contrast in both your films to be extremely kind of different and compelling. Yo-Yo, in your film, you focus on a cloud, like Leila outlined. It's a large fabric sculpture spanning several meters that was created in 2013 and reactivated several times during public performances all around the world, like kind of just reiterating that. And Lebohang, you animate and narrate your family's photo albums. Would both of you kind of speak about the language scapes each of your films kind of create and delve more into?
Yeah, Lebohang maybe, or me.
Whichever.
Okay, I can begin there. My work is more in the vision is to do something coming from history or something that has roots in the territory, and always from a territory that work begin to appear. And the cloud was a way to cross borders and to cross a different way to see reality and history. And when I've done the cloud in Paris, near Paris, the idea was to imagine that the cloud was able to hear the people's thoughts. So it's like it was an amplifier. It was an amplifier of the people's thoughts and history around him. So when I use the cloud, it's like an actor that can carry the thoughts of the people around him. So when he's able to cross borders, it's ask the question of are we able to cross borders? Are we able to carry our histories in another country? Are we able to migrate? And also, are we able to come back from a migration? And especially when I have done the performance in Niger, the question was to cross the river, the Niger River, and symbolically it was asking to the people there, do they accept the idea that migrants can come back into the country and be accepted in the society? And I asked the artist there, who have done the performance, because we wrote the different performance together. It was a collective writing. And all of them said that it wasn't easy to come back from migration in Africa. But when they came back, some of them could try to rebuild an history. And that was the difficulty of and the problematic I wanted to ask into the cloud.
So I think, with my work and my practice over the last few years, it's mainly centered around trying to get to the sort of correct surname. So I went on a journey around South Africa to locate family members that I'd never met before, because of our surname or our family name being spelt in these 4 different ways. And that's sort of how my quest of this family history, that's where it started. It started with me investigating our family name and trying to get to the root of the name, basically. And so that sort of translates into all of the works since 2012, all of these works that I've sort of been looking at or been creating are basically from that initial point of investigating the family name, which then resulted in me having access as I traveled and tried to locate my family around South Africa. I then obviously came across a lot of the family photo albums, which then I'd sit with the family members that I'd meet as I'm traveling and looking for them, and they'd tell me who each person in the photograph was and the story behind some of the photographs. And so the film that I presented, Gesaliteng, is from one of the family photo albums that I found from my grandmother and some of the stories. And it basically becomes how I imagine these stories that they're telling me. So I then use a lot of the imagery from the photo albums and imagery that I then source or then reenact to recreate the story that my family is telling me about the family name or where they moved and the different parts that they lived in South Africa, and and the stories behind how the family name sort of evolved over the years, and it sort of becomes, and so it includes a lot of elements. The film includes a lot of elements of fantasy, because to a large degree it's my imaginings of their stories, of this history.
Yeah, that's really perfect. Kind of the slippage between fantasy and fiction is really kind of prevalent and something that I'm thinking about a lot. And I'm currently in Cairo, where I'm from, and I haven't visited in 2 years. And we have also family albums that I started really looking into, and I have been discovering, new narratives about my grandparents, things that I have never been told and I don't know. And I'm conducting kind of a little bit of oral history. And I've been really kind of thinking about the same things: what is fact and what is fiction, what is a history of a nation that's being kind of retold through personal histories in pictures, and like what is this slippage? And Yo-Yo, also for you touched on a little bit also on the cloud and the fantasy and the kind of coming all together and what it represents, and these activations, and in a way as well, like watching the film and seeing how people are carrying this fabric, and it seems very ceremonial and kind of also between fact and fiction. You don't know if it happened or imagined. So yeah, I kind of wanted to open up a discussion about how your works and both these works and practices and your thoughts kind of relate to fantasy as they are, initially presented as, and they are facts and things that either took place or pictures of events that did take place before.
I mean, for me, I think what's always interesting around this concept of language is how something like a book sort of solidifies, and it sort of solidifies this narrative. So beyond the question of whether it's true or it isn't. So I think that for me, what's interesting also with working with a material like the photo album, which then also becomes or takes the form of a book, is how it sort of solidifies like a family story or a family history. But also what's interesting is all of the things that aren't really part of the photo album. So how it becomes the story of like this family, but it's actually not really the reality. It's like how all of the photographs that have outlived my mother are of her as this, woman dressed a very certain way, but that's not how she looked on a day-to-day. There aren't any photos of her as like a factory worker. So there's no record of the fact that she was a factory worker since she was like 21 years, up until she passed away. So it's like this 30-year journey of this woman going to this job every day, which takes up a lot of her time. There's no record of it in this sort of book that stands to represent, or these documents that stand to represent this family history or this narrative of this particular woman. And that's with a lot of our family albums. So I think when you think around it in the same sort of context as sort of historical books, and just what's left out and what isn't written in, it's really the same sort of thinking, And so I sort of look at it also in relation to sort of children's storybooks and how they become this space for all of this fantasy. So the film sort of plays on these pop-up books and these children's books, and it takes on a similar sort of language. So thinking around a book that sort of represents history, but thinking around it also in relation to these fantastical books, and just relating that to more historical documents, and relating that again to language, and the languages that sort of get lost, and the languages that are sort of the official languages.
Yeah, I want to say something about Lebohang work also. There is so many parts of our intimate history that are missing. And so we try to find a way to reconnect the whole story, but there is a lot of missing parts. And what I like in your work is the silence and some faces that not appears on your work, and so you have to imagine what happened and what were their feelings at the time. And for me, the cloud was quite the same. It looked like in different ceremony. For example, in my mother country, Madagascar, there is a ceremony when we every maybe 50 years or less, we celebrate the people who are dead, and we take the bodies out of the ground, and then with their fabrics on it, and then we change the fabrics, and then we celebrate it in a very big event, and then we put them again on the ground. That means we carry the body. We carry the body with a white fabrics on it. And then it becomes a party that is very important in this country. And for example, the cloud for me wasn't also a cloud, it was a body also. Because in some of the performance, we carried it. And some of the performance, there was helium on it, it was flying. So it wasn't the same situation in all the performance. And when we carried it, it was like a birth of a giant baby, maybe, or maybe it was we are bury it. We don't know exactly the meaning, and that the purpose of my proposition is that we don't know exactly what happened. And the way that people wanted to go into this story is maybe it was as wide, it was enough wide to, the meaning was not so clear, and then everybody could project their feelings and their history into under the protection of the cloud, because it was like a protection, and we all need something that can help us to rebuild our intimate story and also collective story, because we try to imagine that our parents or grandparents were in a society where they were included. And so the problematic of the migrants, for me, the migration and the fact that we have to carry roots from another country, for example, and we have to find a way to be in peace with these kind of roots, to rebuild another culture. And the cloud, it was a process for me, and as an intimate history also, to help me to rebuild with an album. It's look like I've done photography, of course, and I came from photography, and I do some photographic album also with family pictures also, and also with collective portraits of people who are focused in the idea of being together in a collective gesture.
Yeah, it's really interesting to also think about, we've been talking about language, but kind of a little bit more, conceptually. And during both your answers right now, I was reminded of your visual language as well. Like, it's very present. Lebohang, you also decided to end your film at a moment that is really kind of striking and memorable, and I remember that a lot. And the animation of the albums is done aesthetic, like in a very kind of intentional aesthetic way. And Yo-Yo also, the Super 8 camera and kind of the black and white aesthetic and the landscape and the highlighting of the landscape in that way is kind of also is nostalgic in a way, and is also kind of about discovery. And all of that kind of comes together in both your films to really communicate fantasy and fiction and memory as fantasy and memory as fact. And that to me becomes really memorable and very, very striking. So if you can also go a little bit more into the visual language that you decide to use to communicate your thoughts.
Yeah, the black and white for me is like it's more out of time, of course, and I don't try to go back into the proto cinema, but of course it is a proto vision. Like, what is the memory of the light I received when I was born, and what will be the last light I will receive when I will die? What will be the last image I will carry with me when I will die? What will be the last sensation of light that can help me to cross my life? What are the lights that I want to carry with me? And so the black and white, at the beginning, it was the revelation of photography when I was a teenager, and I began to practice photography in high school, and I became responsible of the laboratory, the photographic laboratory lab. And so I did my first print. I was 14 years old, and it was magical. It was amazing. And so I try to, all the time, I try to remember this wonderful sensation to make appear an image, to create an image that will hit my retina, like the light when not exactly I remember the light, but I feel the sensation of the light that was around me when I was born in Niger, near the river where I've done the performance. That performance precisely has been really near the place where I was born. And for me, it's like an archaeology of light, an archaeology of what light do on us on our construction, and it's part of an intimate memory, and it's part of a collective memory also. And the best way for me was photography and the film also, like the real film, the black and white film or in Super 8, it do the same thing in me, that the light do like a time machine. So it makes me go across the time. And when I go into near this river in Niger, I see the light. It's like it's exactly the same 2,000 years ago. And it will be probably maybe, I don't know, but in the future, it could be exactly the same. So it's like, I don't care exactly about when it was done, but what happened there is the meeting between peoples and what they have done together into this light. So maybe it's my conception of cinema or photography. Maybe what I try to do.
I mean, I think for me that the reference to the sort of material of the photo album is quite apparent in the work, and you know, and that those elements of that I mentioned of like the pop-up book and you know, thinking about the photo album as like a children's book, as like the space that allows for you to sort of reimagine your history. So it becomes like, you know, so I think as I was looking at, for example, my mother's photo albums, which had these cutouts from like magazines with like maybe a photo of like flowers or a cutout of some words, like something like "on this lovely day," and then a photograph of her underneath. So the books are so the photo albums are very, you know, they follow a sort of narrative, and they sort of constructed almost as a storybook, you know. And so I think that for me, that's why I related so much to sort of children's books and children's storybooks, which have like a picture and then like, you know, a one-liner and then for me with like the cardboard cutouts. So I use the cardboard cutouts to create. So I use the photographs that I then got from the photo albums, and then produce them in these as like these small cardboard cutouts and create almost like a theater set, and then create, you know, and then that's what's used for the animation process. And then in the digital space, then all of that is sort of creates a sort of pop-up book in terms of how I do the transitions. But, you know, but that space for fantasy has a lot to do with the fact that, you know, when my grandmother or whoever would tell the stories, how they tell them today is different, how they tell them tomorrow for the exact same question. And, you know, and so when you think around also oral histories and how they, or just history in general, and how it's got all of that space for a sort of imagining or reimagining of the exact same story or the same person, how, you know, how you speak about what this photograph was about today, and then how they then tell a story tomorrow is completely different. Not completely, but it's quite different. And so this, you know, this animation and all of the sort of the black and white silhouette figure also makes room, I think, for that, and it speaks to a large degree to that. So the fact that it can also be just anyone's family history, it can be anyone's story, and you know, and it sort of changes, because it's also about how they want to be remembered. So in terms of how they compose the photo album, and you know, and that's why for me the photo album is such a powerful tool, or the family photo album is such a powerful tool, because that's sort of the one space that they have for the sort of this imagined person, or like an ideal self, or like an ideal life or future, and how you want to be remembered. So you sort of put that down in terms of, you know, how you want to be remembered.
I think that's really beautiful. And as you were speaking, it brought up this memory for me, which is why both of your works really resonate with me. There is this ability, Yo-Yo was talking about being able to cross borders or being able to migrate or being able to come back once you do. And I think that that concept translates very much to history. Like, we're migrating to the past in some ways. And once you get so deeply rooted in the past, are we able to come back to the present and build toward a future? It's funny because until maybe a few months ago, I'd never seen an image of my father as a teenager. I only know what he looks like, you know, as he exists presently. I hadn't seen an image of him as a young person because it was burned down during the Civil War in Liberia. And so one day I received an image emerged on my cell phone, which is quite literally the cloud now. Both of you are referencing this cloud, both in memory form and in sculptural form. And it really it connected me back to this past. And we're never able to really imagine a past without having some kind of material connection to it. So I'm curious, thinking about the cloud has this weight for both of you, even though it's supposed to be something light, something weightless. History has that same kind of heaviness, that gravity, because you're carrying the unknown. And we're always rooted in this history, this unknown history. And there's this collective reckoning with the past, and you both are doing this creative rebuilding. So I'm curious, how have you reckoned with not knowing? Or how have you been able to use your work as a catapult to understanding your future?
Yeah, for example, in the Niger adventure or performance, we spend 2 weeks workshop with different artists and searchers that are based in Niger, and we try to imagine how we can make a scenography or a mise en scène of the performance of the cloud, and we dig into the history of each of them to find connection, to find a way to understand the past of the Niger culture, which is very mixed of different people coming from a lot of area around West Africa. And for example, I've done a work about the French colonization during many years. And what was interesting for me to reveal in Niger in this performance is the history that came from before the different kind of colonization. That's been going back into the Middle Age and maybe before the Middle Age. In Africa, that's been the 9th century, the 10th century, the 11th century, etc., because we have the Muslim colonization that was very important before the colonization of the French people in the French area. And for example, we decided to use a suit that is a mix of black and white. It was from a people that called the Gonthier in Niger, and they were like I can say griots or shamans. It was an animist culture. It is an animist culture that is really active in Niger for everybody, but on the night. That means during the day they are Muslim. That means they're Muslim because it is the dominant culture actually in Niger. But everybody do a syncretic attitude between different cultures that are in West Africa and in Niger especially. And for me, it was really important to say that, not to say, because it's not me, I don't say that, I just hear that from the other fellows artists that that were active on this project, and they say that, for example, during the day they go to pray as Muslim, so they respect and they are Muslim, and during the night when they have problems, for example, they go into the Gonthier culture, that means the animist one, which is in Africa, in West Africa, since 1,000 years. So what is important for me is to put different scale, different layers on the works, as if you can see the work with its appearance, you can imagine that you can dig and find different kind of layers that can explain to you how we can find everybody can find something that is important to do something common, and to talk about a common culture mixed of tracks of histories, and also is the only way to build visions of future for me.
I mean, Leila, I'm just listening to you. I was just listening to you, speak around the photograph of your father. And, you know, for me with the work, as when I started it thinking around my, the family name, as I mentioned, but then it eventually somehow became around my grandfather, who'd passed away. And so he'd passed away before I was born. But, you know, as I was, you know, trying to research my family history, everyone kept on telling me about this man. So, you know, and, you know, I'd only known him through photographs that I have of him. And in all of the photographs, similar to my mother, all of the photographs, he's wearing a suit, you know, and so he becomes like this man in a suit. And, you know, and also similar to my mother, he was a factory worker. So he's like, you know, so these photographs that, you know, these sort of 10 photographs or so that we have of him and that my grandmother has of him, he's this man in a suit and in a hat. And so, you know, and so also I think that for me, this idea that Yo-Yo was also touching on of how, you know, there's like a ceremony where they change the fabric that they've buried someone in is always for me, you know, when I think around the family photo albums and these, and it's particularly the clothes that, you know, that the people are wearing, which, you know, and especially with people or family members that have passed on, that have, you know, are now like ancestors, and how these clothes have such significance because, you know, they chose also to be represented in a very particular way. And this is how we then remember them, you know. And so when I then did the series about my mother, where I wore my mother about 3 years after she passed away, and I found the exact locations where she'd been photographed and wore the exact clothes that she was wearing for those photographs, because they were still in her wardrobe. So these are clothes that she was wearing in her 20s and her 30s. And when she passed away, she was in her 40s. And so these clothes had sort of outlived her, and similar to the photographs. So they become like this archive, and, you know, they stand in for her history. So it's like when I then go to the locations where she'd been photographed, which most of them look similar, not exactly the same, but some are still the same. So thinking around archives as a space or as clothes, and, you know, just beyond also just being photographs. And so, you know, and so I think even as Yo-Yo was speaking around the fabric, that, you know, that they cover the people that had passed away in, it was making me think around that, and around how these clothes have, you know, are now, you know, they sort of represent my mother. So it's like they're in her wardrobe and they sort of represent her and her history. And when I wear them, I sort of wear them with that history. And especially when I then reenacted these photographs of her. And even when I then reenacted the photographs of my grandfather, and I'm looking for like an identical suit. And, you know, and replaying or restaging the stories that my family had told me about my grandfather. So that element of like fabric and material was is important in this history that I'm telling of my family, which I think that's sort of something as we're speaking that ties in quite closely with Yo-Yo's work. So materiality is definitely an important aspect in all the different works for me.
Yeah, this is super beautiful. Thank you so much, both of you, for your answers, and Leila for your question. I've always thought about memory. I was a history major in undergrad, and I think about memory a lot because I do have a photographic memory, so I kind of take it for granted. And I remember the first time I heard that the strongest tie to your memory is a smell, and smell isn't to be captured in pictures or in oral history or in stories. It's just something that kind of is triggered as soon as one smells something. And I think of like nostalgia and seeing pictures. I was also the firstborn in both families, so there's so many pictures of me as a child. And so I have an imagination of who I was as a child because of the family albums that were particularly curated for me as a kid. So I think about a lot the accuracy of remembrance, and if that is indeed important, or what is important when one is representing oneself to one's children, or a version of yourself that kind of exists, and what is this accuracy, and if it's, if it's actually reliable, to have that be a choice of how people are remembered, or how we are remembered, or even our memories as kind of an accurate archive, but rather kind of the archive lives in the fabric, the materiality, the ceremonies, the memory of the collective memory of the ceremonies, and kind of, all of that kind of lives around a specific community or society or city. Okay, these are some thoughts, but we actually have 2 questions from the audiences, and I just want to be mindful of time, and I'll read you the first question, and we can give time to answer it. And okay, it's from the first question is from Lynn Barbary. Sorry, I'm a little dyslexic, so this will take a little bit of time. Talking about photo albums reminds me of how, since I was a young child, I would look at pictures at my grandparents in Japan before they immigrated to America, and then coming to Oakland in California in the early 1900s. As I grew up and looked at their albums, every so often, I'm now 72 years old, I would wonder more, and when I would wonder more what their stories were about their families and leaving their families to America. It's a story, excuse me. Okay, and the question, how need to be able to archive as you all create to tell personal stories, histories, and making films? Sorry, so this was a comment and not a question, but if you want to comment back.
I mean, for me, it had the photo album definitely, I think, had a lot to do, or the research around the photo album on my end had a lot to do also with trying to track back my family, because a large part of what the research was about how my family ended up in the city, and how they left the farms behind, and so I think that the photo album also, I think, has speaks a lot to that. So for me, it speaks a lot to the story of migration. I think similar to what Len is speaking around, and about how you sort of look back to these photographs and the different locations that the family lived, and it just speaks to, I think, a large history. In my instance, to a large degree, it speaks to apartheid and the forced removals, and land that now we can't go back to or can't access, that we have no claim over. So so for me, the story of the photo album has all of these elements to it. It's beyond just the record of you know, the sort of imaginary, but it's tied to all of that history of apartheid.
Yeah, I have mixed feelings about doing a photo album. Of course, I'm coming from drawings and photography first, and then I've done many albums, many photo albums, and I have my parents' photo albums. And for example, I don't have any pictures. I have maybe 2 pictures of one of my grandmother coming from Vietnam. And so that's mean there is so many things I don't know about her that I always try to rebuild what has happened around this culture. And so what I think it helped me to build my personality is to try to find a way that culture that goes through you and through your parents and through your descendants when you have children, without any objects also. So for me, objects are really important, of course, because I am a visual artist and I do objects, and at the same time, I try to find a way to observe, for example, how bodies can transmit, for example, the way you work or the way your parents used to work, and when you see your children working, you can see the transmission of of their ancestors' cultures through the way to work, for example, or through the way to exist on the space. So, I mean, the body language. And for example, it could be as important as objects, and I try to make some image of that. So it's like for try to make image, or try to find image that can show the invisible and show what is metaphysical and what can be as strong as objects that can transmit history or memories. But it's not so easy, of course, because it's like try to find in the shadow what can happen behind the things or the objects that is on the light. And I don't know if I am clear, but the invisible part of the aura, or what is around the objects, what is around the photographic, what is around a face on a photography, on an old photography, for example, is what I am looking at.
Yeah, it's yeah. Thank you so much for that. It was really clear, and it's really profound. Thank you. Actually, our next question is from Elizabeth, and it's to you, Leila. What was your curatorial process for this exhibition? How did you decide which films to include? Were there other films you wish you could have included in the exhibition?
Thank you, Elizabeth, for the question. It's always interesting when someone asks me my curatorial process, because it's, I'm sure you know, Yomna, being a curator yourself, that it's kind of, you know, we live and breathe work. It's always in our consciousness. And I was aware of these films, and I would say, you know, there were so many films that were floating around in my head for this program. But the reason why I chose these four being Yo-Yo, Lebohang, Kalu Oji, who's from Australia, who's Nigerian from Australia, and Tavita Rezaire, is because they were all telling very different stories, and they were all centered in very different parts of the world with very different connections to Africa. And, you know, a lot of my curatorial history is focused on what I like to consider or call transnational Blackness, meaning a kind of Blackness that isn't just centered around American Blackness or African Blackness or just the diaspora, but something that exists more so in a world that is beyond color, and it's more of a metaphysical understanding of what it means to live in those histories, live in the shadows of those histories, and the future of what it means to be Black in this world. So choosing these films were quite easy. I don't think that there were films that I wish I could have included. I think it's quite a perfect, small, succinct program. I think that's an unfair question also. These films were perfect for each other because they were so very different. Some of them were one of them, Tabita Rosaire, was deep down title is very rooted in the digital language. And Kalu Oji is referencing the moon, and it's a child narrative. And then Yo-Yo is referencing the sky and the cloud and this journey, this migration journey, while Lebohang is talking about family. And so there's this line that I saw that connected them all very seamlessly. And even if, audiences can't see that line that is quite literal for me, I know that there is something that is deeply felt when watching the four of them together. And I think we got to some of those themes in this conversation. Very beautiful.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, go ahead.
No, I thank you, Leila, because it's very pertinent what you said about how you build your program, and thank you for that.
Thank you for being in it.
Speaking of, the idea of transnational Blackness and the idea of Africa kind of as a homogenous place. I remember actually in the Bay, I was in a lift, and the person was asking me where I was from, and I said Egypt, and he was from Eritrea, and he knew so much about Egyptian history, and he asked me if in school we learn about African history in like growing up kind of in elementary school or what have you, and we learn about Arab history and Egyptian history. We don't in like kind of the government kind of official history schools or in school, we don't learn about African history. And that kind of really struck me, that I knew through my school education very little about African history. And just through going into a history program, however, my focus was Middle Eastern history, unfortunately. But yeah, it was kind of a really something that I haven't thought about, to understand someone's imagination of the self and kind of what encompasses that, and what is anyone's experience in history and the storytelling of one's own past. So I think what I gleaned from the program is this kind of vast array of language, be it visual language, conceptual language, different thoughts, how also like how people relate to their subject matter and to one another. So that's also something that I really kind of, it was very prevalent to me watching your films and getting more acquainted with your practices and the different questions echoing into it. Do we have time for one more question? Do you all also have any questions for one another? I always like to also open it up so that I'm not.
I mean, we're so close to the end here.
I know, exactly. That's.
It's always that point in the conversation where you can go on another hour, or you kind of have to have this perfect place. I do want to remind everyone who's watching or listening that Beyond the Sky will be up through February 27th. So if you are in the Bay Area, please get over to the Museum of the African Diaspora and sit with these films. I think the program in total is a little under an hour in length. So you can sit there, 3 times through, which I always recommend. You shouldn't just watch these films once, you should watch them multiple times. And I am located in the Bay Area right now, so if you have any questions or want a walkthrough of the exhibition, please feel free to reach out. I'm always happy to talk about these films with you. And thank you all again for being here for this conversation. It was very rich, just as I had anticipated, and I hope you all have a really good rest of your week. Yomna.
Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you. And thank you so much for coming. And thank you so much, Leila, for the invitation. And also, please go and watch the films, and also try to watch them, if you watch them many times, in different orders, because I feel like this really kind of adds a lot to the experience. Start in a different place and then a different place, kind of have this experience. It's really, really wonderful. Okay, have a good rest of your day and or night, wherever you are.
Yeah, thank you, Leila. Thank you, Yomna. Thank you, everybody. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you all for being here so much and for this incredibly rich conversation. And thank you, Leila, for reminding everyone to come to the museum. February 27th is the day that this exhibition closes, and we have beautiful exhibitions that accompany this film exhibition as well. So I encourage you all to stop by here at MOAD. I thank everyone for being here from around the globe. And I do want to mention that this program is being recorded. It will be archived on our MOAD's YouTube channel, so we can share it with folks who weren't able to be with us today. And we do love to hear your feedback on our programming. So if you have a moment to fill out a program survey, there's a link to it in the chat. It should also pop up in your browser when you close this Zoom. And as always, we welcome any donations to the museum to keep the work that we're doing to celebrate the art and culture of the African diaspora going here at MOAD. And again, we have lots of virtual programs. So if you aren't in the Bay Area, please connect with us on other virtual programs. And we look forward to seeing you in person or on Zoom. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Elizabeth.
Thank you.
Yo-Yo and Lebohang, I hope to see you.
Yeah, yes, absolutely.
Take care, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.